Welcome back to France 24. We are live from Paris. The headlines this hour. Sudan witnesses the worst day of violence since President Omar al-Bashir stepped down. According to medics, at least 30 people were killed after security forces stormed a protest camp in Khartoum. Donald Trump attends a state banquet at Buckingham Palace, the US president getting the royal welcome on day one of his visit to the United Kingdom after he called London's mayor a stone-cold loser before touching down. And a Swedish court rejects a request to detain Julian Assange. The ruling states that since the WikiLeaks founder is already in custody over in Britain, he can be questioned by prosecutors from Sweden in relation to a rape investigation in 2010. Sudan has witnessed its worst violence since President Omar al-Bashir stepped down in April. According to the Central Committee of Sudanese Doctors, at least 30 people were killed after security forces stormed a protest camp in the capital. People were seen fleeing the streets and bursts of gunfire were heard in Khartoum. The main protest group has accused the ruling military council of a massacre as it cleared the sit-in near the defense ministry. Earlier in the day, there were reports that at least 116 people were wounded.
The unmistakable sound of gunfire, panic and chaos penetrate the streets of the Sudanese capital as Sudan's military leaders disperse protesters from the months-old sit-in camp located outside the army headquarters. The Transitional Military Council denies it used violence to clear the site, despite the many witness accounts and images suggesting otherwise.
We as Sudanese hold the security forces accountable based on eyewitnesses for the dispersal of the sit-in. The security forces have betrayed the Sudanese people, from security to police and army, as well as rapid security forces.
Protest leaders say more than a dozen were killed and over 100 injured in the operation. The demonstrators insist they won't let the violence deter them. As soon as the sit-in site was dispersed, many had already returned to the streets.
After the dispersal of the sit-in, we went back to the streets and squares. And thank God, with the help of the youth, we closed the street. And we will close everything again, God willing.
Egypt, one of the Transitional Military Council's key allies, has urged both sides to show restraint, with officials from the United States, the African Union and the EU urging the army to protect civilians.
We expect the Transitional Military Council to act responsibly and in respect of the people's right to peacefully express their concerns.
The recent developments are sure to further delay negotiations between the Transitional Military Council and pro-democracy activists. An alliance of protest and opposition groups said they are cutting off all contact with the army in response to Monday's violence. Talks had already hit a wall in mid-May over the leadership of the Sovereign Council. While the protesters want a civilian to preside over the transitional body, the military wants to maintain overall authority during the interim period.
Earlier, we spoke to Sharita Srinivasan from the Center of Governance and Human Rights at Cambridge University, who said the crackdown on protesters makes him wonder if there will be a revolution in Sudan at all. Take a listen.
It's certainly a sign that this is a battle that is only just beginning. If this was a quiet revolution, a non-violent revolution, a civilian revolution, then there is a question tonight whether there is going to be a revolution at all. It has been brewing for some time, and there's certainly been some clashes, both in terms of the negotiations over what the future political dispensation will be, but also just clashes between protesters and members of the military council. And now this has come to a head. There have been signs, as I said, and it seems that most recently the backing that the Transitional Military Council received from powerful Arab states in the region has given them this license to crack down on the protesters. I think the talks failed because there's always been a very different two tracks going on here from the beginning. This was a civilian uprising, a set of peaceful demonstrations that had called for the overthrow of President Omar al-Bashir. Now that was achieved, but it was achieved with a kind of pact with military and security actors that were fundamentally from within the regime. So there was always going to be a challenge as to how a transition could occur that would actually have these new leaders removing themselves from power right at the moment when they knew that they would be facing a push for a peaceful civilian democratic government that wouldn't necessarily want to keep them in power or not necessarily even free. So it was always going to be a very difficult negotiation, the problems of which arose right from the beginning when certain elements of the military and the security establishment ostensibly sided with the protesters in removing President Omar al-Bashir from power. That pact, that achievement was always tainted with the risk that it wouldn't actually lead to the change that the civilian protesters wished for.
Britain has rolled out the red carpet on day one of Donald Trump's state visit, which was dominated by royal engagements. This evening, the US president is attending a state banquet at Buckingham Palace. The trip is intended to celebrate the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain. But Trump weighed into the country's internal affairs and renewed his attacks on London's mayor before touching down in the capital, calling Sadiq Khan a stone-cold loser. Now, here's Donald Trump raising a toast earlier to the Queen Elizabeth on behalf of all Americans. Take a listen.
From the Second World War to today, Her Majesty has stood as a constant symbol of these priceless traditions. She has embodied the spirit of dignity, duty, and patriotism that beats proudly in every British heart. On behalf of all Americans, I offer a toast to the eternal friendship of our people, the vitality of our nations, and to the long-cherished and truly remarkable reign of Her Majesty, the Queen.
Now, Prime Minister Theresa May extended the invitation for this state visit when she became the first foreign leader to meet Donald Trump after he became U.S. president. The United Kingdom is considered the U.S.'s oldest ally, but the two sides don't always see eye to eye. Simon Harding reports.
A special relationship, but one which has never been as controversial and difficult as today. David Cameron had already seen Britain's partnership with the United States cool significantly during the Obama administration. Multiple times the then US president expressed strong views on Britain's colonial past and role in slavery, Obama choosing Germany and France as pathways into Europe instead of historic allies Britain. Theresa May's ascension to power in 2016 was followed by the election of Donald Trump in November of that year. The president was famously seen holding hands with the PM during her visit to the White House, the beginning of an awkward relationship. But at an economic summit in Davos in 2018, May, in a true show of friendship, said that the UK's relationship with the US remains special.
We continue to have that really special relationship between the UK and the United States. We're standing shoulder to shoulder because we're facing the same challenges across the world. And as you say, we're working together to defeat those.
A partnership fraught with inconsistencies in foreign policy on NATO, the UN, Israel, Palestine, Iran, climate change and multilateralism. Trump has consistently and in true Trump fashion pushed forward policies at odds with decades of British ideas and beliefs. On trade, both countries are supposedly waiting to conclude a huge independent deal. Only Brexit and its completion remains in its way.
As you know, they want to do trade with the United States, and I think there's an opportunity for a very big trade deal at some point in the near future, and we'll see how that works out.
Even more acrimonious is the president's constant involvement in British politics, whether criticising May's Brexit performances, publicly supporting opposition politicians such as Nigel Farage, and even more recently, endorsing Boris Johnson, a hugely divisive figure in British politics. Mayor of London Sadiq Khan questions whether or not Britain in future years will regret having granted a state visit to Donald Trump. But the UK itself is divided on the issue, with Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt saying the visit should rise above party politics.
This is the President of the United States. We're celebrating the D-Day landings when we had 1 million American servicemen stationed in the UK willing to risk their lives for our liberty. for democracy, for our values. And I think that this should be above party politics.
A show of pomp and glamour which is fitting with the style of the US president, as the UK and US celebrate the D-Day landings, freedom and the world's greatest struggle for justice and democracy. What Winston Churchill called a special relationship now seems to be resting on the edge of a knife.
A court in Sweden has rejected a request to detain Julian Assange. The country's public prosecutor had been hoping the WikiLeaks founder would be extradited from Britain over a 2010 rape investigation. But the court ruled that since Assange was already in custody in Britain, he could be questioned by prosecutors from Sweden. Olivia Salazar-Winspear reports.
He's staying put for the moment. Julian Assange is not to be extradited to Sweden, as a judge in Uppsala rejected a request for him to be detained in absentia. However, he's still being investigated regarding allegations of rape.
The court has decided that right now it is not proportionate to grant pre-trial detention for Mr. Assange in his absence, because in its view, we can move the investigation forward without this, but through the use, for example, of a European order of investigation.
The prosecutor had requested that London hand over Julian Assange to the Swedish authorities. For that, they'd need an extradition order, which was refused on Monday. Assange is currently serving a 50-week jail sentence in the UK for skipping bail, which saw him spend 7 years in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. The rape allegations were made in 2010. Prosecutors dropped the investigation in 2017, but reopened it in April after Ecuador withdrew its offer of asylum to the Australian national. The former WikiLeaks founder is also wanted by the US on charges which include conspiracy and espionage. Since he's detained in a British prison, it's now up to the UK's Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, to decide on whether to extradite Julian Assange to the US or not. Last month, the UN expert on torture claimed that Assange would likely be subject to severe psychological trauma in the US and persecuted for more political motives than judicial purposes.
Rescue teams in India say they've spotted 5 bodies as they scale the Himalayas for 8 climbers who went missing in an avalanche last week. 4 Britons, 2 Americans, an Australian and an Indian disappeared during a climb of the country's second highest peak. It comes amid the deadliest season on record for those seeking to scale the increasingly overcrowded Mount Everest. Catherine Bennett reports.
These 4 British climbers were lucky to return. They survived an avalanche and sought refuge at a base camp near Nanded Devi. It's the second highest mountain in India, reaching up more than 7,800 metres. The group was airlifted to safety after being spotted by rescue helicopters. 8 other climbers who headed for a different peak are still missing. They never made it back to base camp.
An Air Force helicopter team was sent twice on a survey mission. They spotted these 4 mountaineers and also searched other areas but found no trace of them. We couldn't find their location.
This year's death toll has been particularly high. At least 11 people have died in the space of a few weeks. Many blame rampant overcrowding on the world's highest peak. This year, Nepal issued 381 permits, more than ever before. That's not counting the Sherpas, who also scale the mountain. Short windows of good weather mean that everyone tries to reach the top at the same time, causing huge traffic jams in the final stage of the climb, which is known as the death zone. As climbers' oxygen runs out, every minute can be deadly. Novice climbers are putting themselves and others at risk.
They force us to. Their bodies can't handle it. We tell them to stop, that they will die, but they insist because they've paid money to be there. People are dying because of their stubbornness.
Many professionals want the authorities to clamp down on climbers focused on reaching the summit at all costs.